It was a still spring morning, the kind where the air feels almost sacred. The soft rustle of leaves danced with a gentle breeze, and the warmth of the sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light on the quiet street. At the center of it all was Helena's house, a modest home cradled by a wild, vibrant garden. Helena, 78 years old, sat in her worn armchair by the window, a faded photo album resting on her lap. The photos inside held her life, weddings, birthdays, quiet moments with her late husband, Antonio. She traced the edges of a black and white picture with a trembling finger. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. And then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic fluttering of wings broke through the quiet, pulling her from her memories. She looked up, startled. Outside her window, hovering midair, was a tiny hummingbird. Its feathers shimmered in the morning light like green jewels, its wings beating so quickly they were almost invisible. Helena froze. The bird wasn't flitting between flowers like they normally did. It was staring. Its dark, beady eyes locked with hers through the glass. For a moment, time seemed to pause, the only sound being the rapid hum of its wings. Then, gently but deliberately, the bird tapped its delicate beak against the window. Once. Twice. Helena leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, her heart suddenly racing. "What on earth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The hummingbird didn't move. It just hovered there, its tiny body so close that she could see the iridescent pattern of its feathers glinting in the sunlight. There was something unnerving about its gaze, something almost purposeful. For 10 whole minutes, the bird stayed. It didn't care about the sweet water she had left outside, nor the blooming flowers in the garden. No, it was fixated on her. As if it was trying to tell her something. Unable to resist her curiosity, Helena pushed herself out of her chair and shuffled to the window. Slowly, she unlatched it, letting the crisp spring air flood into the room. The hummingbird didn't enter, but instead hovered just inches away, its gaze now more intense. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. For the next few days, the hummingbird returned at the exact same time. Always to the same window. Always with the same behavior. No amount of food or flowers could distract it from whatever was drawing it to her. At first, Helena found it amusing. Then she found it unsettling. And finally, it became something she couldn't stop thinking about. "What do you want?" she muttered one afternoon as the bird lingered yet again, refusing to leave. But this time, Helena noticed something different. Her breath hitched as her eyes moved past the bird to the wooden frame of the window. There, in the faint morning light, she noticed a tiny crack in the wall. At first, it seemed insignificant, a weathered mark from years of exposure. But something about the way the bird hovered near it, made her step closer. With trembling fingers, she reached out to touch the crack, leaning in to inspect it. And that's when she saw it, a small, rolled-up piece of paper tucked inside the crevice, hidden just out of sight. Helena's heart stopped. The bird, as if satisfied, flew away. Helena was not the kind of woman who believed in coincidences. Life had taught her that the universe rarely worked that way. At 78, she had lived alone for more than 20 years, ever since the love of her life, Antonio, passed away. Her children, now adults with busy lives in faraway cities, called as often as they could, but the silence in her house had long since become her closest companion. Every day, her routine was the same. She woke early, tended the wildflowers in her garden with the same care Antonio once had, and brewed herself a cup of chamomile tea. In the afternoons, she would settle into her armchair by the window, an old photo album perched on her lap. As she flipped through the pages, she relived the golden days of her youth, the laughter, the love, and the irreplaceable moments she had shared with Antonio. Antonio had been a simple man, yet his heart overflowed with love, not just for Helena, but for everything that grew and thrived in their small, shared world. A gardener by trade and by passion, he spent hours cultivating their yard into an Eden of color and life. He would kneel in the soil, dirt staining his hands, and whisper to her, "Flowers talk, Lena. You just have to learn to listen." She would laugh, calling it one of his poetic whims. But deep down, she adored his gentle way of seeing the world. The last time Helena felt truly connected to nature was the morning Antonio died. It was a warm summer day, and the garden outside was alive with blooms. As she sat by his bedside, a hummingbird appeared out of nowhere. It darted through the air, hovering above the flowers as though performing a graceful dance. Antonio, frail and pale, pointed to the tiny bird and murmured with his final strength, "He's come to get me, Lena." Listen to him, hours later, he was gone. Since that day, Helena had never seen another hummingbird. Not a single one. Until now. For the past several days, the small green hummingbird had returned to her window at the exact same time. Its behavior unnerved her, not because it frightened her, but because it seemed deliberate. The bird wasn't interested in the flowers in her garden, nor in the sugar water she had prepared and set out. No, it seemed fixated on her. It hovered by the glass, tapping its beak as if demanding her attention. Helena tried to brush it off, calling herself silly for reading too much into a bird. But as the days passed, the feeling deepened. This was no ordinary bird. Its presence stirred something in her, a strange mixture of longing, curiosity, and unease. "What do you want?" she muttered to herself one morning as the bird returned again, insistent as ever. It darted back and forth, its tiny wings a blur, refusing to let her ignore it. And then Helena noticed something she hadn't seen before. Near the edge of the window, on the wall just outside, was a tiny hole. It was barely visible, a small crack in the wood that had likely been there for years. But something about it caught her eye that morning. Driven by an unshakable feeling, she unlocked the window and leaned out. Her heart raced as she looked closer. The hummingbird hovered nearby, its wings still buzzing softly, almost as if it were waiting. Helena reached out and, with trembling hands, touched the edge of the hole. Inside, she felt something. Something small and fragile. Carefully, she pulled out a piece of aged, yellowed paper, rolled so tightly it fit perfectly in the crevice. She unrolled it slowly, her breath catching in her chest as she recognized the handwriting immediately. Antonio's. The words, written in his unmistakable script, sent a chill down her spine. "For you, my last secret. Where the garden blooms, love never dies." Tears filled Helena's eyes, blurring the words on the page. Her fingers trembled as she held the note. She couldn't believe it. Antonio had hidden this for her. For her. How long had it been there, waiting for her to find it? Her gaze lifted to the hummingbird, which hovered just a few feet away, its tiny body glistening like an emerald in the sunlight. She didn't know how or why, but she was certain of one thing: the bird was leading her. Antonio had sent it, and this message was only the beginning. Overwhelmed with emotion, she clutched the note to her chest and turned toward the garden. Her mind raced. Was there more? Was this only one piece of a puzzle Antonio had left behind? The hummingbird darted toward the garden as if to answer her unspoken question, pausing to hover near the old wooden trellis at the far edge of the yard. Helena wiped her tears, grabbed her pruning shears, and headed toward the flowers Antonio had planted so many years ago. Her heart pounded as she reached the trellis, following the bird's movements. Whatever Antonio had left for her, whatever secrets remained buried, Helena was about to uncover them. With the note clutched tightly in her trembling hands, Helena stepped into the garden, her heart pounding against her chest like a drum. The hummingbird darted ahead of her, its iridescent feathers catching the afternoon sunlight, shimmering like tiny emeralds. It moved with an urgency that mirrored her own, weaving through the air, pausing now and then to ensure she was following. Antonio's words echoed in her mind, filling the quiet with their haunting tenderness. Where the garden blooms, love never dies. What had he meant? Was it just a poetic goodbye, or had those words always carried a deeper meaning? Helena's eyes roamed the garden Antonio had once poured his soul into. Rows of vibrant red roses stood tall and proud, their petals full of life. Clusters of white daisies swayed gently in the breeze, innocent and timeless, while towering sunflowers stretched toward the sky, their golden faces glowing in the sunlight. This garden was more than soil and flowers. It was Antonio's legacy. His heart. But today, it felt different. As if something was hidden beneath the surface, something waiting to be found. She moved slowly, searching every corner of the yard with a mixture of hope and desperation. Her weathered hands brushed past rose thorns and lavender stalks as her eyes scanned the ground for any sign of what? She didn't know. Another note? An object? A sign? Her mind churned with possibilities, each one as impossible as the last. The longer she searched, the more doubt began to creep in. Her knees ached, her hands were scratched from digging in the dirt, and her breath came in short bursts. Maybe this was all just a coincidence. Maybe the hummingbird's appearance and the note were unrelated, the ramblings of a mind too eager to cling to the past. Antonio was gone. No bird, no words, no mystery could change that. But then, as if sensing her doubt, the hummingbird moved again. It flitted toward the farthest edge of the garden, past the flowers, to a forgotten corner Helena hadn't visited in years. There, covered in thick vines and wild overgrowth, stood the old wooden pergola Antonio had built when they were first married. Helena froze. The pergola had been his pride, a quiet sanctuary where they'd once spent long summer evenings sipping lemonade and watching fireflies dance in the twilight. After Antonio's passing, she couldn't bring herself to sit there anymore. Over time, it had fallen into neglect, swallowed by ivy and time itself. But now, the hummingbird hovered there, circling the structure like it was beckoning her closer. Her chest tightened. Was it possible? Could this be what Antonio had meant? Gripping her gardening shears, she took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The pergola loomed before her like a relic of another life. Its wooden beams were heavy with vines, the air around it thick with the earthy smell of damp leaves. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the dense foliage. And then, with a deep breath, she began cutting. Each snip of the shears was deliberate, sharp, and echoed in the stillness of the garden. The vines resisted her, as if guarding a secret, but she pushed forward, clearing a path into the shadowy interior. The hummingbird zipped around her head, its movements frenetic, almost urgent, as if encouraging her to keep going. Finally, after what felt like hours, Helena stepped through the last curtain of vines and stopped dead in her tracks. In the center of the pergola, partially hidden beneath years of moss and dust, sat a small wooden chest. Its surface was weathered, the edges smoothed by time, and its metal hinges were rusted but intact. A sturdy lock, old and crusted, kept it sealed. Helena's breath caught in her throat. Her knees buckled as she knelt in front of the chest. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the rough wood. The chest felt familiar, like an extension of Antonio himself. But the lock stopped her. She tugged at it, frustrated, her heart sinking. What if she couldn't open it? Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the hummingbird again. It wasn't hovering this time. Instead, it had landed on the ground near the corner of the pergola, where the dirt seemed unnaturally soft, as if it had been disturbed. Helena crawled toward it, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. With trembling hands, she began digging. The earth was cool and crumbly beneath her fingers. It didn't take long before she felt something solid. Her breath hitched as she unearthed a small metal object, a key, tarnished but intact. Her heart thundered in her chest as she held the key, glancing at the hummingbird, which now perched silently on the pergola's edge. It felt like it was watching her, waiting. Hands shaking, she slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. The click of the mechanism echoed like a whisper from the past. With a deep breath, Helena lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, neatly arranged in a bundle tied with twine. Each one was addressed to her in Antonio's handwriting. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She picked up the first envelope and carefully opened it. The letter inside was simple, yet it carried the weight of the universe. For when you feel alone. Helena's hand flew to her mouth as she sobbed. She opened another. For the day you need strength. And another. For when you're ready to remember how much I loved you. Her shoulders shook as she read the words Antonio had left behind, words written with the care of a man who knew he wouldn't be there to say them. Each letter was a lifeline, a piece of him reaching across the chasm of death to comfort her. As she clutched the letters to her chest, the hummingbird landed gently on the edge of the chest, as if to say, "You found it." But then her tear-filled eyes caught something else in the chest. At the bottom, tucked beneath the letters, was a larger envelope, sealed with wax. It was heavier than the others, and the sight of it made her heart skip a beat. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. The seal was unbroken, its surface embossed with the delicate imprint of a flower, a symbol Antonio had always associated with her. Helena's hands trembled as she stared at it. She knew this envelope held something more. Something final. For a moment, she hesitated, overcome with the weight of the moment. Whatever was inside would change everything. Helena sat frozen, the weight of the envelope pressing down on her trembling hands. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just paper, but a piece of Antonio himself, a fragment of his soul that had crossed the barrier of time and death to reach her. Her breath caught in her chest, and her heart raced as the hummingbird perched silently on the chest's edge, its black eyes watching her with an almost human intensity. It wasn't just a bird, it was a guardian, a witness to this moment. Gathering her courage, Helena slid her fingers beneath the wax seal. Her touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were handling something sacred. With a soft crack, the seal gave way. The envelope opened, revealing a folded letter and something small wrapped in a delicate piece of faded cloth. Her hands shook as she unfolded the letter, her pulse pounding in her ears. The paper was yellowed with age, but Antonio's handwriting was unmistakable, strong, deliberate strokes, as vivid as if he had written it yesterday. "My dearest Lena," the letter began, and Helena's tears began to fall before she had even read the next line. His voice seemed to leap from the page, wrapping around her like a warm embrace. "If you found this letter, it means that fate has led you back to our special place. I knew you'd come when your heart was ready, when love and longing outweighed the pain of loss. I've waited for this moment, Lena, knowing you would one day hold this in your hands." Helena pressed the letter to her chest, as if it might bring her closer to him. Her sobs came softly, mixing with the rustling of the leaves outside. The hummingbird remained still, as if giving her space to absorb his words. "Inside this envelope," the letter continued, "is a gift. Something that was always a part of our dream, but that time and life kept us from achieving together. This gift belongs to you now, Lena, to carry forward our legacy of love, growth, and care." Helena lowered the letter and carefully unwrapped the cloth. Her breath hitched when she saw what it contained, a small, ornate key, its surface etched with a delicate floral design. It sparkled faintly, catching the light that filtered through the pergola's vines. She stared at the key in wonder, her mind racing. "What is this, Antonio?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Her gaze flicked back to the letter, her tears making the ink blur slightly as she read the next lines. "Do you remember our dream house? The one we used to sketch on napkins over coffee, the house with the big garden you wanted, and the veranda where I'd sit and watch the sunsets with you? I built it for you, Lena. I built it for us." The paper slipped from Helena's hands as she gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. She clutched at her chest, feeling her heart thunder beneath her palm. "I never told you because I wanted it to be a surprise, but time was not kind to us, my love. After I left, I made sure the house was waiting for you. It is yours now, a place of refuge, a space to dream again, to plant new seeds of hope. The key you hold will open the door to our final dream. The address is written on the next page." Helena sat motionless, her breath shallow as Antonio's words sank in. A house? Their dream house? All these years, she thought their plans had vanished with him, but he had made it real. He had built it. For her. The hummingbird suddenly took flight, circling her head in quick, urgent movements. It seemed almost impatient, as if telling her, there is no time to waste. With shaky hands, Helena turned the letter over and saw the address scrawled on the back. She recognized the name of the village, a quiet, picturesque place they had once visited on a trip, where they dreamed about living someday. The house was there, waiting for her. The realization sparked something inside her, a long-buried energy she hadn't felt in decades. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed the letter and key to her chest. "I have to go," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "I have to see it." But the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden. Night was falling, and Helena knew she couldn't make the journey alone in the dark. Reluctantly, she returned to the house, her mind racing as she prepared for the journey ahead. That night, she barely slept. The key sat on the bedside table, its glint visible even in the dim moonlight, She lay awake, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories, hopes, and questions. Where had Antonio found the time? How had he kept it a secret? What would she find waiting for her at the end of this journey? The hummingbird did not return that night, but Helena felt its presence nonetheless, as though it were out there, waiting to guide her at dawn. At sunrise, Helena rose with purpose. She dressed in a simple, flowing dress, the same one she used to wear on her Sunday walks with Antonio, and tucked the key into her purse. Her frail hands trembled slightly, but they were steady enough. The road to the village was long but beautiful, winding through rolling hills and fields painted green and gold by the morning light. The air smelled of wildflowers and dew, a scent that tugged at Helena's memories. As the car bumped along the country road, she clutched the address tightly, her heart hammering in anticipation. And then, as she turned the final corner, her breath caught in her throat. There it was. The house stood proudly at the edge of a sprawling field, just as they had imagined it all those years ago. A quaint, picturesque home with large windows, a wraparound porch, and a garden that seemed to stretch forever. Though some of the paint had faded with time, it was still full of life, as if waiting patiently for her arrival. Helena stepped out of the car, tears spilling freely now. She felt as though she had stepped into one of their old sketches. The hummingbird reappeared, darting ahead of her as if to say, "You're here. Open the door." With trembling hands, she approached the front door and slid the ornate key into the lock. The click of the mechanism was soft, yet it reverberated through her chest like the closing of a long chapter. The door creaked open, and Helena stepped inside. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating a room filled with warmth and familiarity. Everything was exactly as Antonio had described it, the cozy furniture, the rustic wooden floors, and in the center of the room, a table with another letter addressed to her. Helena picked it up, her tears falling onto the page as she read Antonio's final message. "Welcome home, Lena. This house is more than a memory. It's a new beginning. Plant flowers here. Laugh here. Love here. And know that I will always be with you, in every bloom, in every sunset. This is where love lives. This is where we live."